The words significant progress have now been used to describe the outcome of every single round of US-Iran nuclear talks since this process began in February of 2026. Round 1 in Muscat on February 6th, significant progress. Round 2 in Geneva on February 17th, significant progress. Round 3 in Geneva on February 26th, significant progress. 3 rounds. 3 identical verdicts from Oman's foreign minister, Badr al-Busaidi, the Omani diplomat who has been shuttling between American and Iranian negotiators like a man trying to stop 2 freight trains from hitting each other on the same track. And after each round of significant progress, the exact same result. No deal, no agreement on the central issues, no movement on the questions that actually matter, and a new meeting scheduled for the following week with a new city attached to the promise of continuation. Muscat led to Geneva. Geneva led to another Geneva. And now the third Geneva has produced what diplomats are calling technical talks in Vienna, scheduled for the first week of March 2026 to be held at the headquarters of the International Atomic Energy Agency. And the question that every analyst, every military planner, every journalist, every oil trader, and every Iranian family buying bread in Tehran is asking right now is exactly the same question. Is any of this real, or is Iran simply buying time? And if it is buying time, how much time does it actually have left before the 2 carrier strike groups sitting within operational range of Tehran stop waiting and start flying? Let us lay out the complete picture of where things stand as of this moment, because the details matter enormously, and the gap between the official language of diplomacy and the reality on the ground is as wide as it has ever been. On February 26, 2026, Steve Witkoff, Trump's special envoy for the Middle East, and Jared Kushner, the president's son-in-law and senior advisor, sat in the Omani ambassador's residence in Geneva, across a diplomatic process that was still technically indirect, meaning Iran's foreign minister Abbas Araghchi was in a separate room, and Oman's Busaidi was walking back and forth between them with proposals. According to Tasnim, Iran's semi-official news agency, Witkoff and Araghchi did briefly meet directly, though only for a few minutes, 6 hours of talks in total. 2 sessions, separated by a break, during which Witkoff and Kushner, in one of the most surreal diplomatic moments of the year, had a side meeting with Ukrainian officials, while supposedly in the middle of last-chance nuclear negotiations with Iran. And at the end of it all, Araghchi came out and told reporters that the talks were the most intense so far, that good progress had been achieved, that both sides entered a serious review of the elements of a potential agreement in the nuclear field and on sanctions, and that the next step would be technical discussions in Vienna next week. Busaidi called it significant progress, posted about it on social media, and immediately flew to Washington to brief Vice President J.D. Vance. And Trump told reporters in Texas on Friday that he was not thrilled with the way Iran was negotiating, that they were not willing to give what he needed to have, and that it was too bad, but that more negotiations were taking place. Now, let us strip away all the diplomatic language and look at what actually happened in Geneva on February 26th, because the substance of what was presented and what was rejected tells you everything you need to know about why Vienna is a trap and not a breakthrough. Iran walked into Geneva with what its own officials described as a politically serious and technically creative proposal. Here is what that proposal actually contained. Iran was willing to temporarily suspend uranium enrichment, not permanently dismantle it, not abandon it, temporarily suspend it. Iran was willing to dilute part of its existing stockpile of 60% enriched uranium, which is the level just below weapons grade, down to lower levels. But the dilution would happen inside Iran, under IAEA supervision, with the diluted uranium staying in Iran, nothing leaving the country. Iran was willing to accept tighter IAEA inspections, but specifically excluding military sites, meaning the facilities where the most sensitive and potentially weapons-related work is being done would remain off limits. And Iran was willing to allow the U.S. access to economic opportunities in Iran related to oil, gas, and the purchase of aircraft, essentially saying it would give American companies business deals in exchange for the lifting of sanctions. What Iran was absolutely and explicitly not willing to do: permanently halt high-level enrichment, dismantle its nuclear facilities, export its uranium stockpile abroad, cap its centrifuge development, discuss its ballistic missile program, or discuss its support for regional proxy forces. And here is what the United States walked into Geneva demanding, as reported by the Wall Street Journal citing unnamed U.S. officials. Iran must destroy all 3 of its main nuclear sites, Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. Iran must hand over its entire stockpile of enriched uranium to the United States. Any deal must last forever with no sunset clauses. Iran must halt ballistic missile development, and Iran must end its support for armed groups in the region. When you put those 2 positions side by side, you are not looking at a negotiating gap that clever diplomacy can bridge over a weekend of technical talks in Vienna. You're looking at two positions that are not on the same conceptual planet. Iran is offering a temporary pause on enrichment, with everything staying inside the country. The United States is demanding the permanent destruction of the infrastructure that makes enrichment possible, the physical removal of the stockpile from Iranian soil, and an eternal agreement with no expiration date. An Iranian official was blunt during a break in the talks, telling Al Jazeera that Iran had rejected the idea of permanently abandoning enrichment, dismantling its nuclear facilities, and moving its uranium stockpile out of the country. The head of Iran's Government Information Council, Elias Hazrati, came out after the talks and said with complete clarity, "Nothing will leave Iran. Enrichment will continue in accordance with our needs, and the only options on the table for the stockpile are things like dilution. That is not a negotiating partner moving toward a deal. That is a negotiating partner restating, in the most public way possible, every position it walked in with." And yet, here we are, moving to Vienna. Why? Why does a negotiation in which the two sides have irreconcilable positions keep producing more meetings? And the answer to that question is what makes the Vienna talks not a sign of diplomatic progress, but a strategic trap. Though the question of who is being trapped and who is doing the trapping is more complicated than most headlines suggest. From Iran's perspective, every day of continued talking is a day that the bombs are not falling. The U.S. military buildup that is currently assembled in the region is the largest concentration of American naval and air power in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group has been in the Arabian Sea since January 26th, with its air wing flying round-the-clock operations. The USS Gerald R. Ford, the most technologically advanced aircraft carrier ever built, a $13 billion vessel displacing over 100,000 tons and powered by two next-generation nuclear reactors, transited the Strait of Gibraltar on February 20th, stopped briefly at Soda Bay in Crete to resupply, and on February 26th, the very day the Geneva talks were concluding, departed the Greek port and headed toward the coast of Israel, where it is now positioned as part of what Trump himself called an armada. Together, those two carrier strike groups bring over 90 combat aircraft into the theater, including 4 FA-18 Super Hornet squadrons on the Ford alone, EA-18G Growler electronic warfare jets capable of jamming Iranian air defenses, E-2D Hawkeye airborne radar platforms for real-time airspace management, and Arleigh Burke-class destroyers loaded with Tomahawk cruise missiles. The destroyers supporting these two carriers include the USS Winston S. Churchill, USS Bainbridge, USS Mahan, USS Frankie Peterson Jr., Spotter USS Spruance, USS Michael Murphy, and several others, creating a combined Tomahawk launch capability that amounts to hundreds of precision strike missiles ready to fly on command. Add to that the B-2 Spirit stealth bombers and F-22 Raptor fighters that have been forward deployed in the region, the combination that was used in Operation Midnight Hammer in June 2025, and you have a strike package of historic scale sitting loaded and pointed at Iran. On February 24th, 2026, 12 F-22 fighter jets were deployed to Avda Air Base in southern Israel, the first deployment of offensive American weaponry on Israeli soil, using Israel's hardened aircraft shelters to protect them from potential Iranian counterstrikes. Satellite imagery reveals that tanker aircraft, which are essential for refueling strike packages over long distances, have been quietly shifting from Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, which sits on the Persian Gulf and is therefore vulnerable to Iranian ballistic missiles, to Prince Sultan Air Base in Saudi Arabia, deeper in the interior and harder to hit. 3 E-3C aircraft, which are the airborne command and control platforms that manage and coordinate large strike packages, have been deployed. U.S. Fleet headquarters in Bahrain, according to Fox News reporting from February 26th, had been reduced to fewer than 100 mission-critical personnel. All ships based in Bahrain had left port. Both of those steps were previously taken as defensive measures in 2025, immediately before the United States struck Iranian nuclear sites. The Pentagon confirmed to CBS News that all military forces deployed to the region are expected to be in place by mid-March. Top national security officials told Trump the military is ready for potential strikes as soon as this past weekend. Poland, Germany, France, and other European countries have urged their citizens to leave Iran immediately. The State Department ordered non-essential American diplomats to leave Lebanon. A U.S. Air Force plane used to command Special Forces operations landed at Ben Gurion Airport near Tel Aviv on February 19th. Israel's military has publicly stated it is preparing for a hypothetical scenario in which Iran attacks Israel first. This is the backdrop against which Iran is proposing that the two sides hold technical talks in Vienna. In the language of chess, what Iran is doing is not making a sacrifice or attempting a bold offensive move. It is using every tool available to delay having to make the move that would end the game. Because from Tehran's perspective, the moment the talks formally collapse and the diplomatic process is visibly dead with no next meeting on the calendar, the last political constraint on a U.S. military strike disappears. As long as there is a Vienna meeting scheduled, Trump has to at least weigh the optics of ordering an attack while negotiators are on their way to the IAEA headquarters. The moment Vienna ends without a deal and no new round is scheduled, that restraint evaporates. Iran understands this completely. Its proposals in Geneva were not designed to be accepted. They were designed to be interesting enough to keep the process alive without conceding anything that the Iranian system considers non-negotiable. But here is where the trap has two sides, because the US is also engaged in its own form of delay that serves its own military purposes. Trump gave Iran a 10 to 15-day deadline on February 19th. He said those 10 to 15 days were pretty much maximum. He said bad things would happen if no deal was reached. And then, when the Geneva talks ended without a deal on February 26th, he agreed to more negotiations. He said more talks were taking place. He went to Texas. He said he was not thrilled, but he was watching what happens. The official deadline he set has already technically expired, or is expiring within hours of this account being written, and yet the military is not moving. There is a very specific reason for that, and U.S. officials have been remarkably transparent about it. All military forces deployed to the region will not all be in place until mid-March. The Ford only crossed into the Mediterranean on February 20th. The full strike package, with all the tanker aircraft repositioned, all the destroyers in position, all the F-22s in their hardened shelters in Israel, all the B-2s pre-positioned, and the complete logistics chain established for what would be a sustained air campaign rather than a single surgical strike, will not be complete until mid-March. The 10 to 15-day deadline was never really about 10 to 15 days. It was about creating the political and diplomatic architecture to justify military action while the military hardware was still moving into position. The Vienna technical talks, from Washington's perspective, buy the time needed to complete the military deployment. From Tehran's perspective, the Vienna technical talks buy the time needed to harden more facilities, perhaps bury more centrifuges deeper underground, and exhaust the political will for war on the American side. Both sides are using Vienna. Neither side believes Vienna will produce an agreement, and somewhere in the middle of this mutual performance, the clock is running toward an outcome that nobody is publicly committed to preventing. The specific mechanics of why the gap between American demands and Iranian offers cannot be bridged in Vienna are worth understanding in detail, because the technical teams being sent to Vienna are not being sent there to invent new physics. They are being sent there to discuss things like the specifics of uranium dilution procedures, IAEA inspection protocols, the timeline for sanctions relief, and verification mechanisms. All of those are genuinely technical questions that would need to be resolved if a deal existed, but a deal does not exist. The foundational disagreement is not technical. It is political and strategic. The United States has stated through every relevant official that it will not accept any nuclear enrichment taking place on Iranian soil. J.D. Vance said the principle is very simple. Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Marco Rubio said the Iranian insistence on not discussing ballistic missiles is a big, big problem. The Wall Street Journal reported that U.S. negotiators brought demands to Geneva requiring Iran to destroy Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan and hand over all enriched uranium, and that any deal must last forever. Those are not technical issues. Those are existential demands. And Iran has answered them not with silence, but with the clearest possible words. Enrichment will continue in accordance with our needs. Nothing will leave Iran. Dismantling nuclear facilities is off the table. Missiles are not part of nuclear negotiations. There's one narrow area where something like a theoretical bridgeable gap exists, and it is worth examining because it represents the only scenario under which Vienna could produce something that both sides could call a deal. The U.S. has signaled, according to reporting from Axios, that it may show some flexibility on Iran's demand to retain the right to enrich uranium, but only if Tehran can prove there is no path to a bomb. Iran, meanwhile, has put forward a proposal that some analysts at the Arms Control Association have described as a possible basis for a limited face-saving agreement. Suspend high-level enrichment, dilute the existing 60% stockpile under IAEA supervision inside Iran, accept more intrusive inspections of declared sites, cap the size of the enriched uranium inventory, and in return receive full sanctions relief, including the lifting of both US and UN sanctions. Ali Shamkhani, a senior advisor to Khamenei, wrote on X during the Geneva talks that if the core issue for the United States is simply ensuring Iran does not seek to build nuclear weapons, that aligns with Khamenei's own religious fatwa against nuclear weapons, and that an immediate agreement was within reach. That statement is significant because Shamkhani sits within Khamenei's inner circle, and it suggests there may be at least a theoretical version of a deal in which Iran accepts intrusive enough inspections and low enough enrichment levels to satisfy the technical requirements of a non-weapons program, in exchange for the U.S. accepting that enrichment infrastructure stays on Iranian soil. But there are at least three enormous obstacles that make even that narrow theoretical deal extremely difficult to achieve in the days remaining before military action becomes the more likely outcome. The first is the ballistic missile issue. Rubio has been increasingly explicit that Iran's ballistic missile program is a major problem and must be part of any agreement. Iran has declared this a red line with equal explicitness. Its missiles are not nuclear. They are conventional military assets that Iran views as essential to its national defense and as the primary deterrent against Israeli or American attack. Asking Iran to discuss limiting missiles in the context of nuclear negotiations is, from Tehran's perspective, asking it to disarm in the very area where it retains genuine offensive capability. There is no scenario in which Iran accepts missile limits in these negotiations. If the U.S. insists on them, the talks end. The second obstacle is the inspection demand. The U.S. wants intrusive inspections that allow monitors to verify Iran cannot secretly rebuild parts of its program or hide nuclear material. Iran has already blocked IAEA inspectors from visiting the sites that the U.S. bombed in June 2025, sites where satellite imagery shows ongoing reconstruction. Allowing international inspectors into those sites would reveal both the extent to which the facilities have been rebuilt and potentially the locations of new, deeper facilities that Iran has been constructing in secret. Iran will not allow that. The third, and perhaps most fundamental obstacle, is the question of whether Trump can accept a deal that leaves Iranian enrichment infrastructure intact. His core demand, stated repeatedly in the most public way possible, is zero enrichment on Iranian soil. Any deal that falls short of that accepts even a limited, inspected civilian-level enrichment program, will be immediately attacked by hardliners in Congress, by Netanyahu's government in Israel, and by the wing of his own administration that has consistently pushed for regime change over nuclear limitation. Trump would need to be able to declare victory, and it is genuinely unclear whether any agreement Iran is capable of offering meets that political test. The Israeli dimension of this crisis is also accelerating in ways that make the diplomatic window even narrower than the calendar already suggests. Israel has reportedly threatened to preemptively attack Iranian nuclear installations with or without U.S. forewarning. Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu told Trump directly and repeatedly that he is skeptical Iran can be trusted to uphold any agreement, and has urged the administration to press Tehran on both the missile program and the ending of support for Hezbollah. Hebrew media outlets reported on February 19th that a U.S. Air Force command and control aircraft, used for Special Forces operations, landed at Ben Gurion Airport near Tel Aviv. Senior Israeli officials have told reporters that Israel has assessed the U.S. has reached a high level of readiness for a strike, and that Iran is stalling. The IDF has publicly stated it is monitoring developments and is on alert for defense, with instructions for the population to follow official channels only. Netanyahu has stated publicly that if the Ayatollahs make a mistake and attack Israel, they will face a response they cannot even imagine. This is not a country that is waiting passively for diplomacy to run its course. Israel has its own independent calculus about Iran's nuclear program, its own timeline, and its own willingness to act unilaterally that creates pressure on the entire diplomatic process independent of whether Trump wants more time. The geopolitical reaction outside the immediate theater is also feeding back into the dynamics. Russia issued a formal warning against unprecedented escalation of tension around Iran and called for restraint. This came directly from Nikolai Patrushev, a senior security figure in Moscow, which signals that Russia is watching the situation with enough concern to go public. China publicly stated that countries should stop pushing sanctions and inciting confrontation. Saudi Arabia and Jordan have both stated they will not allow their territory or airspace to be used for U.S. strikes on Iran, a position that significantly complicates the logistics of any extended air campaign. The U.S. has been reported to have been blocked by Gulf allies from using their bases, which is why tanker aircraft have been relocated from Al Udeid to Prince Sultan, a Saudi base deeper in the interior whose use was apparently negotiated separately. Britain has denied Trump's request to use Diego Garcia, the British Indian Ocean territory that hosts a major U.S. base ideal for B-2 bomber operations due to its range and existing infrastructure. All of these constraints are real and shape what any military operation against Iran actually looks like in practice. And yet Iran knows that none of these constraints are absolute. The B-2 bombers can reach Iran from the continental United States with in-flight refueling, and in June 2025 they did exactly that. The carrier strike groups do not need Gulf airspace. The Tomahawk missiles on the destroyers can be launched from the Gulf of Oman and the eastern Mediterranean. The F-22s in Israel and the naval air power on the two carriers can provide the suppression of air defenses and the strike coordination that a major campaign requires. What the constraints mean is not that the U.S. cannot strike Iran, but that a sustained campaign aimed at comprehensive regime change or total infrastructure destruction becomes logistically harder and politically more complicated. A targeted campaign against nuclear and missile sites, a bigger version of Operation Midnight Hammer, remains entirely within the military capability that is already in place. And multiple U.S. officials have confirmed that Trump has been briefed on a limited strike option, hitting a few military or government sites as a first step, designed not to end the regime but to pressure it into making the concessions that diplomacy has so far failed to extract. The Wall Street Journal reported that Trump is weighing exactly that option, an initial limited strike that would be designed as coercive diplomacy, military force to create new diplomatic leverage, rather than a full-scale campaign. The distinction between a limited strike and a full-scale campaign may seem meaningful in Washington. It may seem considerably less meaningful in Tehran, where the IRGC has already stated publicly that if America attacks, all U.S. military bases, facilities, and assets in the region constitute legitimate targets. Iran delivered a formal letter to the UN Security Council saying exactly that, explicitly warning that American bases across the entire Middle East and the Persian Gulf would be considered fair game in any defensive response, putting at risk tens of thousands of American service members stationed in Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Jordan, and Syria. Iran's own posture on the eve of the Vienna talks is a study in deliberate ambiguity. Its foreign minister says a fair, balanced, and equitable deal is within reach. Shamkhani says an immediate agreement is possible if the core issue is preventing weaponization. Pezeshkian says Iran is not seeking nuclear weapons. And simultaneously, Khamenei posts an AI-generated image of the USS Gerald R at the bottom of the ocean on his official social media account, writing that more dangerous than the warship is the weapon that can send it to the bottom of the sea. The head of the Government Information Council says nothing will leave Iran, and enrichment continues. IRGC commanders say their finger is on the trigger. The parliament that voted to close the Strait of Hormuz remains in session. Hardline factions within the IRGC, according to multiple analysts of Iranian political dynamics, are pushing back against any concessions in the talks. And the gap between what Iranian officials say abroad during negotiations and what Iranian officials say at home for domestic audiences is consistently wider than the diplomatic language suggests. The hardliners who matter most, the IRGC commanders, the revolutionary councils, the security establishment, view the negotiations as a trap in exactly the reverse of the way Washington views them. They believe that any agreement that actually constrains Iran's nuclear capability, even temporarily, is a concession that weakens the regime's strategic deterrence and creates a precedent for further demands. And they have enough institutional power within the Iranian system to block, undermine, or simply outlast any agreement that Araghchi or Pezeshkian might be willing to sign. What Vienna will produce, in the most optimistic scenario consistent with everything known about both sides' actual positions, is a document that technical teams can call a framework, a set of principles on which both sides agree at the conceptual level, and a delay of another week or two while the political leaderships in Washington and Tehran decide whether to sign anything that actually constrains them. The IAEA Board of Governors is scheduled to meet on March the 2nd in Vienna for 5 days of meetings at which diplomats are expected to consider a new resolution censuring Iran over its continued blocking of inspectors. The last time the IAEA board voted to censure Iran. In June 2025, Israel began military strikes within 24 hours. American officials at the time cited the censure vote as part of the legal justification for Operation Midnight Hammer. The Vienna technical talks are scheduled for the first week of March. The IAEA board meeting is scheduled for March 2nd. The military buildup is expected to be complete by mid-March. Trump has said his deadline is expired or expiring, and Trump told reporters he has not made a final decision on striking Iran, but he has not ruled it out. And he said it would be nice if they could do it without military force, but sometimes you have to. That is where the Vienna trap closes. Not because either side wants it to close that way, not because the diplomats going to Vienna are insincere or the technical discussions they will have are meaningless, but because the structure of the situation has evolved beyond the point where technical discussions in a beautiful Austrian city can bridge the distance between what Washington demands and what Tehran will accept. Iran has 3 days of technical talks. The U.S. military has until mid-March to be fully in position. The IAEA board has a vote that could trigger the same legal sequence it triggered in June 2025. Trump has a president's patience that, by his own admission, has a pretty much maximum limit of 10 to 15 days, a limit that has already passed. And caught between all of this, the 4,600 sailors on the USS Gerald R. now 241 days at sea and extended again, their deployments, stretched from the expected 7 months toward 9 or 10, are steaming toward a position off the coast of Israel and waiting for orders that have not yet come, but that every piece of the strategic logic says are coming. Vienna is not a breakthrough. Vienna is the last act. And the question that nobody can answer with certainty is whether it is also the last chance.